Your hair is looking lovely, lovely, darlings, lovely. But we
Thank
are
you.
continuing to explore this
Yeah.
natural hair legislation and litigation as a civil rights and human rights issue. Professor Wendy Green, if you could start by giving us an update as to where things currently stand. I know you have been one of the many folks who have been active in the Crown Act and in just figuring out ways to use the law to keep us safe. Talk to us about what's happening currently.
Sure. Well, good morning, and thanks again for having me on your show, Lurie. It's so wonderful to see you and Aaron. So good news, in March of this year, Congresswoman Bonnie Watson Coleman out of New Jersey, Yvette Clarke out of New York, and Robin Kelly out of Illinois reintroduced the Federal Crown Act, or the Federal
Excellent.
Creating a Respectful and Open World for Natural Hair Act in the United States Congress. And on the Senate side, Senator Cory Booker and Senator Susan Collins are now the primary co-sponsors of the Federal Crown Act. So for the fourth time that the Federal Crown Act, this is the fourth time that the Federal Crown Act has been introduced since 2019. And again, the United States House of Representatives passed this legislation twice, yet it stalled in the United States Senate. But we're hopeful
Wow.
that in light of this bipartisan support, on both sides of the aisle in both chambers, that this Crown Act will be passed and signed into law. And for
Now,
those who are not familiar with the Federal Crown Act, it is a really vital civil rights legislation that makes clear that discrimination on the basis of hairstyles and hair texture commonly associated with race and national origin in
mm,
workplaces, housing, public accommodations, and federally funded institutions would violate federal civil rights statutes like the 1964 Civil
wow.
Rights Act and Section 1981 of the 1866 Civil Rights Act, as well as the Fair Housing Act.
Now, you said that this is again being reintroduced. It is being reintroduced in a bipartisan effort. Was it bipartisan in the previous times? I feel like Rand Paul from the Republican side was one of the senators who really took issue with this legislation previously. Has it always been bipartisan, or is this something new?
Well, on the Senate side, this is something new. This is a new development. So last
Wow.
year, when it was reintroduced, Senator Susan Collins, pledged her support to support the federal legislation. So that is a new development, and I
Huh.
think a really positive development in terms
Yeah.
of its action and hopeful passage by the United States Senate and ultimately by both chambers of Congress.
Okay, now usually I'm not as kind in my assessment as of Susan Collins because she's always very gravely concerned, but rarely concerned enough to do anything. But it sounds as though perhaps she's found some bravery, some strength. So this is good news, and hopefully there will be enough votes there to allow this legislation to pass into law. Aaron, when you consider what it might mean to go from a state by state approach to the Crown Act to a federal piece of legislation that would have nationwide implications. What does that mean for you as someone who has been a fundamental a feature, quite frankly, of the natural hair industry for so long, but as someone who's also an activist and an organizer trying to push this issue at the state level, what would it mean for you if we could see this implemented at the federal?
I mean, it would mean a whole slew of things. If this was implemented at the federal level, I think there would be a gain on the state level pushing natural hair licensing in a better space, right? Like in a more
Mm,
secured, solidified, foundational approach. Because right now we're working state by state with our legislation, right? And that can be different in every state. But if you have a blanketed, approach like a federal law, that's going to bring a better strength. For legislation in each state because you're going to have
right,
that prototype, right? That
right.
initial legislation. So that's really, I think, a great thing if we can get this on a federal level because it will elevate our industry, right? It will elevate our hair as well because that's
Right.
something, and why we need to have this legislation, unfortunately.
Now, Professor Green, one of the challenges that we have talked about on this show, and it's been really disheartening, is this idea that even once you do the very difficult work of going state by state, introducing it in both houses at the state level, getting it supported perhaps, and then lobbying to have that support expanded to get additional co-sponsors, then we have situations like what we saw happening in the state of Texas, where if the Attorney General is ideologically in opposition to the legislation, they choose not to enforce it. And we saw there was a young boy who we talked about a lot on these airwaves, wore his locks and was told he had to remove it, completely in violation of the Crown Act. And he was not protected or defended. Talk to us about some of the tensions that exist when it comes to getting the legislation passed, and then the additional work that comes with getting the legislation actually enforced.
No, that's a wonderful question, Lurie. And I think it's critically
important. Lurie, like Marie with an L. But
did I say Lurie? I'm sorry.
Everybody does. That's why I have that little thing. It's like Marie with an L. Go right ahead.
I know that in my right mind. Excuse me. So yes, I do know that. Sorry. So that's really, really critically important what you're talking about. In terms of, getting it passed and then ensuring that it is actually enforced in the ways in which, is in alignment with the spirit and the intent and the purpose of the legislation. And so what you're highlighting is oftentimes you will have actors who are charged with the duty of enforcing our civil rights legislation, who may not align with the spirit and intent and purpose of the legislation, even when it is evidently clear, and will enforce it in ways in which are not, effectuating the goals of the statute. And so you make a very excellent point in terms of what has happened on the ground. So one of the things when we are crafting this legislation, or when I have crafted or helped to craft this legislation, advise legislators, we have to be very clear in the language. We have to make sure that the language actually speaks expressly to the kinds of discrimination and discrimination and subordination and extinguishment of fundamental parts of our identities that we're trying to eliminate in our schools, workplaces, in public accommodations, in housing, and in other spaces. So we have to be very clear that we're not only talking about hairstyles and hair textures, but also other characteristics that are associated with our racial identity that oftentimes indicate racial discrimination. And we're also trying to ensure that the plain language of our statutes really make it nearly impossible, except for very exceptional circumstances where you have a bona fide health or safety need. And that's something that has to be proven before you can even engage in forcing someone or compelling someone to cut off their hair as a condition of employment, or to cut off their hair or cover their hair as a condition of matriculation, or to do so to even be able to enter into public accommodations and so forth. So I've been very, very adamant about making clear that too, or those types of actions, those types of discriminatory and oppressive actions are violative of civil rights legislation, popularly known as the Crown Act, so that we can try to prevent, to the best of our ability, prevent the non-enforcement or the flawed enforcement or misinterpretations of our civil rights legislation, like we've seen in the Texas case that you're talking about. So I know that the Texas legislators or the Texas legislators are trying to get back to the drawing board in terms of bring that gap in the language that is being utilized in the misinterpretation of that statute. But it's going to take time. And in the meantime, what we're hopeful for, where we see that possibility, is that when judges are deciding these types of cases, that they are really trying to decide these cases in furtherance of the spirit and intent and purpose of the statute.
Right. And it feels like this is a good place to remind all of us that getting the legislation passed is just one step. If staying vigilant and being assertive and making sure that we are continuing the fight to protect the legislation, because y'all, and we see this not just with the Crown Act, but we see this with anything that we fight for and win legislatively. The people who you beat in your legislative efforts, so let's say we all here, we are in favor of the Crown Act. We fight for the Crown Act. We want to support the Crown Act. There are other people on the other side who do not like it, don't love it, they hate it, they don't want to see it in place because they want the status quo. Once we win that battle and get the Crown Act in place, they don't go to sleep and go home. They then do the work because they are in opposition of it. If they're empowered, they then do the work of organizing to take away the power of what we just won. It is a constant tension. Aaron, talk to us about what this battle looks like on the ground. What do you, as someone who is organizing with the Natural Hairstyle and Braid Coalition, as the legal folks, Professor Green being being one principal among them, as they are doing the work of leading this and advocating in the courts, what should our advocacy outside of the courtrooms look like?
I mean, education, right? As EVP of Education, I think it's really about educating yourself and understanding the processes and efforts that it takes to not only pass a bill or write legislation, but to keep it going and to make sure it stays valid and credible. Because again, like you said, there is opposition to a lot of legislation that we put forth that does get passed, but
Right.
that's not the end. So we
Yeah.
really have to take courses like Advocacy 101 to learn and understand what the process is. We're always going to shout that out because I think, we have a group of people in this nation that are just like, oh, well, they did it, or, oh, they should have did this, or they should have done that. But what it really boils down to is what you as an individual should have done. And that was showed up to do the work. And in order to
Yeah.
do the work, you have to be educated on what that work looks like.
Yeah.